In this video, we'll talk just a little bit about the anatomy of the large intestine and the things that go on in the large intestine. Looking at it grossly, the large intestine forms sort of a picture frame around the small intestine, circling the entire abdominal cavity. You have the first part of the small intestine, which is the cecum, which hangs actually a little bit below the ileocecal valve, which is where the pretty much completely digested at this point mass from the small intestine, where that stuff is coming into the large intestine. Coming off the end of the cecum, you have the vermiform appendix, which is a little pocket of lymphoid tissue. It's a hollow tube that looks a little bit like a worm. That's why it's called the vermiform. That's basically what vermiform means, is worm-like. And there's just a concentration of lymphoid follicles in here. This part often can trap bacteria, can get blocked and become deeply inflamed, at which point it needs to be removed. Acute appendicitis, acute inflammation of the appendix, can actually be very, very dangerous, because if the appendix ruptures, you're just basically spewing infection all over the abdominal cavity. So the trick is to remove it before it ruptures. Moving up from the cecum, you have the ascending colon, and it's called the ascending colon because if you're tracing the path that food waste mass moves, it moves up the abdomen at this point. And you have the transverse colon, transverse because food is moving across the abdomen, descending colon, the sigmoid colon because it's kind of roughly S-shaped, and sigma is the Greek S. And then emptying down into the rectum, kind of the storage unit for waste before it's pushed out the anal canal. Most of what's absorbed in the large intestine is water, but I do want to make a note that about 90 to 95% of the water in your chyme is reabsorbed in the small intestine, and most of the remainder is absorbed from the large intestine. So by the time, under normal healthy conditions, by the time feces leaves the body, there's only about 1 to 2% of the water that was originally in that chyme that is still in the feces. Of course, if you are having diarrhea issues and food is moving through, that food waste is moving through your digestive tract too quickly to reabsorb much water, then you're going to have a higher proportion of water in your feces. The large intestine itself is about 5 feet long. It's called the large intestine because it has a wider diameter than the small intestine. It's about 10 centimeters wide versus the small intestine is about 2 to 3 centimeters wide. And there is the longitudinal layer of smooth muscle is reduced to 3 bands of muscle, and these are called the tenae coli. So there's not really 2 complete layers of muscularis externa around the large intestine. You just have the tenae coli as that longitudinal layer. And these bands of smooth muscle are, under normal conditions, under resting conditions, they're a little bit contracted, and they pull the intestine into these sac-like pockets called haustra. You also have little fat-filled pockets of visceral peritoneum hanging off the tenae coli. These are the epiploic appendages. Not really entirely certain what the function of the epiploic appendages are, if there is a function, but they're there, and they are recognizable on the large intestine. You have strong peristaltic waves called mass movements that occur a few times a day, pushing feces through the large intestine. You also have segmentation happening in the large intestine, and this segmentation is called haustral churning because it mixes the contents of neighboring haustra. Haustra is the plural form, haustrum is the singular. There's a reflex that empties chyme into the large intestine, and that's called the gastroileal reflex. Gastrin, when it's released by the stomach, when the stomach is distended, when you get food emptying into the stomach stretches, that triggers the release of gastrin. And one of the effects of gastrin, it acts on the stomach as well, but gastrin also triggers opening of the ileocecal valve. So when you have new bunches of food moving into the stomach, that actually triggers movement of food out of the small intestine into the large intestine as this ileocecal valve, the sphincter here, opens up. You also have sphincters acting down here at the anus. There are two sphincters at the anus, an internal involuntary sphincter and an external voluntary sphincter. So with peristalsis, those mass movements, forces feces out of the sigmoid colon into the rectum, and as the rectum distends, as it stretches, filling with feces, that triggers a reflexive opening of the internal sphincter, but actually closes the external sphincter. So to actually expel that waste, it requires a voluntary relaxing of the external sphincter. And that's usually a somewhat conscious response, but if the pressure gets too high, in the rectum, the external sphincter will relax involuntarily. This is what happened. This is how infants defecate. Before infants learn that voluntary relaxation of the external sphincter, they just rely on that accumulation of pressure in the rectum to force the external sphincter to relax. This is a cadaver view of the large intestine. You can see the cecum down here with the vermiform appendix coming off of it, the ascending colon moving up, transverse colon, and then the descending colon and the sigmoid colon down there, leading into the rectum and anal canal. These sharp right angle turns that the colon makes are called flexures. So if you hear reference to colonic flexures, that's what they're talking about, these sharp turns. Now, since water is being reabsorbed from the feces as they move through the large intestine, those feces are getting drier and drier as they move, which means that lubricating the passage of those feces through the large intestine is really important. And one of the identifying characteristics of the large intestine under the microscope is enormous numbers of goblet cells. Remember, goblet cells are these mucus-secreting individual columnar cells that they swell with mucus at the apical surface. And that's why they're given the name goblet cell. So you have goblet cells all along the large intestine, just lining the epithelium of the large intestine. And that's one way to identify the large intestine histologically. And these goblet cells secrete mucus that ease the passage of feces through the large intestine. Also in the large intestine, you have the majority of the gastrointestinal microflora. So you have an enormous number of bacteria that make your digestive tract their home, and they are beneficial. They're actually helpful. So you want them there. You want to keep them happy. You want to feed them lots of fiber that they can feed on. The bacteria come entering through the anus. There are a few that manage to make it through the hostile environment of the stomach and the acidity of the stomach and the digestive enzymes in the small intestine. But they usually set up shop in the large intestine. And they help break down indigestible carbohydrates. So basically the fiber in your food that your own digestive enzymes can't break down, some of that can be broken down by bacteria in your large intestine. So there's a little bit of digestion that takes place in the large intestine, but it's not your enzymes doing it, it's your bacteria. Now, unfortunately, when bacteria are breaking down this indigestible carbohydrate material, it tends to release gases, which, depending on what kinds of bacteria you have, can be pretty smelly. That's why high fiber foods like beans tend to leave people feeling kind of gassy, because their bacteria are going to town on the fiber in those beans and producing gas. These bacteria also synthesize a few vitamins for us, some B-complex vitamins and vitamin K. So biotin, folate, pantothenic acid, riboflavin, B6, B12, thiamine. These are all synthesized by your bacterial microflora. And these vitamins that are made by the bacterial microflora, as well as the short-chain fatty acids and other products of fiber breakdown, these are absorbed in the large intestine. So there's a small amount of absorption happening in the large intestine. There's water absorption, and then there's also absorption of these nutrients that are made by your bacteria. Newborns don't have, their gut bacteria isn't established yet. It takes a bit of time for the gut bacteria to really become for their gut to become well colonized. And this is why often newborns will be given an oral dose of vitamin K. Vitamin K is really essential for blood clotting, and so to prevent bleeding disorders in newborns, they'll get a dose of vitamin K so that their body can make clotting factors, and that will hold them until their gut bacteria become established and start making vitamin K for them. Okay, so a few things about the large intestine you should be able to discuss after watching this video and studying it. You should be able to talk about the different regions, so the cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon. You should be able to talk about the digestive activities that are carried out in the large intestine, including the activities that the bacteria do. And you should be able to talk a little bit about the vermiform appendix, both what it normally does as lymphoid tissue and what can go wrong with it.